It's a pleasure to be here. Let's jump right into the content. For me, this is where everything starts, is really this quotation and the idea that the food that we eat can be medicine in certain respects. And we know that thousands of years later, the research has demonstrated that diet is actually the #1 risk factor for death from chronic disease. So today we're going to look at the role of diet in 3 of the biggest chronic diseases that influence our patients, which are blood pressure, diabetes, and high cholesterol. A little bit more about me before we jump into things. I usually tell people that my interest in nutrition started with a science fair project when I was 16, but really I was exposed to nutrition from very early on. And because of this, I decided to pursue a PhD in nutritional sciences. But then wanting to take all of that science and apply it directly to people's lives, I went to medical school. I did my first residency in Toronto where I grew up, and now I'm doing this additional year of residency at the Eastern Virginia Medical School. So let's jump into nutrition and blood pressure. If you could give your patient one recommendation for the thing that's going to lower their blood pressure the most, I want you to think. We won't actually do a survey, but what do you think in your head would be the thing that you would say? Would you tell them to decrease their salt intake? Would you tell them to increase their potassium intake? Would you recommend the DASH diet, or would you tell them to eat 4 tablespoons of ground flaxseed per day? When we look at the data, the evidence actually shows us that the most efficacious thing you can do to lower systolic blood pressure is to eat flax seeds. Let's talk about this for a second. So this came from a randomized controlled trial that tested the effects of 4 tablespoons of flaxseed every day. And they showed that as flax seeds, which are rich in omega-3 fatty acids, as omega-3 fatty acid intakes increased, blood pressure went down. So in order to understand why omega-3s have this effect, we have to first figure out, well, what are omega-3s in the first place? And in order to introduce you to omega-3 fatty acids, I'd like to talk about this thing that I like to call the dietary fat family tree. So the dietary fat family tree is basically a framework for looking at all of the different types of fats and how they're related to one another. The first branch point in the dietary fat family tree is your saturated fats versus your unsaturated fats. And saturated fats are things like butter and lard and beef tallow and from dairy products. Within unsaturated fats, we have a variety of different types. The first branch point is monounsaturated fats, also known as MUFAs, which you get from olive oil and avocados. And then you have your PUFAs, which are your polyunsaturated fatty acids. Now, within your polyunsaturated fat group, we have the omega-6s, things that you get from vegetable oils, things like cottonseed oil, canola oil, sunflower oil. And then you have your omega-3s. But there are many different types of omega-3s. The type that you get from flaxseed is called alpha-linolenic acid, but there are these other types too. For most of American history, people ate saturated fat. Butter, beef tallow, lard, these sorts of things. This didn't change until 1888 with the invention of the first continuous mechanical screw press. This invention enabled humans for the first time in history to extract oil from seeds in quantities that before were not possible. This invention not only changed the food industry, it also fundamentally changed us biologically as human beings. And the reason is because prior to this invention, you couldn't get oil from seeds. Afterwards, suddenly vegetable oils became a dietary staple and entered our diets at unprecedented levels. Vegetable oils are called vegetable oils, but they don't actually come from vegetables. They come from seeds like cottonseed oil, sunflower oil, canola oil, safflower oil, that sort of thing. But the thing about vegetable oils is they are very rich in omega-6 fatty acids. Now, the thing is, omega-6s and omega-3s are very intertwined and related. Historically, we consumed equal amounts of omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acids. Today, we consume 15 times more omega-6s than omega-3s. And this is partially because of the prevalence of these seed oils. Now, in order to understand the significance of this, I want you to think about the fact that you literally are what you eat. And in order to understand that, I want you to think about the trillions of cells that you are comprised of. And in particular, I want you to think about those cell membranes. We all know from high school biology that every cell is surrounded by this thing called the phospholipid bilayer. And the phospholipid bilayer is comprised of these things called phospholipids. And phospholipids have a fatty phosphate head and a fatty acid tail. Those fatty acid tails are often made of omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids. Now, what we know is that if you eat more omega-3 fatty acids, every single cell in your body will be surrounded by more omega-3 fatty acids. On the flip side, if you eat more omega-6 fatty acids, every cell in your body will be surrounded by more omega-6 fatty acids. So why is this a problem? Well, we know that omega-3s and omega-6s are the precursors to prostaglandins, which are messengers in our body. Omega-3 fatty acids send anti-inflammatory messages, messages of vasodilation and antiplatelet aggregation. On the flip side, the prostaglandins that are made from omega-6s are pro-inflammatory. They promote vasoconstriction. They promote platelet aggregation, bad things that we don't want, right? So how do omega-3s ultimately influence blood pressure? Well, like I just said, they promote vasodilation. But even beyond that, it's really interesting if you look at the chemical structure of omega-3s. So omega-3s are sometimes referred to as being the quote unquote kinky fat because of all the kinks as a result of all the double bonds that they contain. The significance of this kinky structure is that it is very much unlike saturated fat. Saturated fats have a hydrogen at every carbon valence opportunity that they can exist at. And thus, you have these very straight, linear hydrocarbon chains, which can line up really nicely and enable a fat to be solid at room temperature. Omega-3s cannot be arranged in such a way. Instead, they kind of are all over the place. This enables a more fluid and flexible cell membrane, which if your vessels are made from more cells with more omega-3s, you have more flexible blood vessels and thus lower pressure. And this has been demonstrated in studies that have shown that the more omega-3s you eat, you see a decrease in arterial stiffness. If we look at the data, research shows that if you compare the blood pressure lowering effect of 4 tablespoons of milled flax seeds to the blood pressure lowering effect of a single first-line blood pressure medication, the effect on systolic blood pressure is largely equivalent, which I think is pretty impressive. But there's an important thing to know, which is that you can't actually absorb the omega-3s from flax seeds unless they're crushed. So you want your flax seeds to be crushed to get a maximal benefit. And the other thing is because of those double bonds, omega-3s are very vulnerable because those double bonds can get oxidized. So it's also best to store omega-3s in the freezer. Moving along to one of the most notorious nutrients associated with blood pressure, that being sodium, which we commonly get from salt. We know that sodium is a positively charged ion. Meanwhile, water is a very polar molecule with a very negative component to it. So the reason salt raises blood pressure is because the more salt you have in your bloodstream, which is positively charged, the more water you then attract to it, and thus the more pressure you have with all that extra water in your bloodstream pushing on the vessels. One thing that patients always say to me is, well, I don't even have a salt shaker, which is a good first step because you don't want to be adding extra salt. But we know that actually most of the salt that our patients are eating, it's not coming from the salt shaker. It's coming from processed foods and it's coming from restaurant foods. Data has shown that 77% of our dietary sodium comes from processed and restaurant foods. And it's really interesting if you go somewhere like, say, Dunkin' Donuts, and say you're trying to decide between a corn muffin and a wake-up wrap. How can you guess which has more salt or more sodium? Well, this is not always easy to predict. So for example, in this comparison, the corn muffin actually has more salt than the wake-up wrap, which has cheese and eggs and bacon, things that you would think would be contributing more salt. Another interesting comparison is, let's say you're trying to be healthy. You go to Chick-fil-A and you order the Cobb salad instead of their original Chick-fil-A chicken sandwich. But guess what? That Cobb salad has more salt than the chicken sandwich. So sodium is a very tricky nutrient because it can often be hiding in a lot of places. If you look at the top 10 sources of sodium in the American diet, the #1 place where people are getting sodium from is actually bread. So it just goes to show that it's not even the saltiest foods that are contributing the most sodium to our diets. It's the foods that have a moderate amount of salt, but that we're eating large quantities of. There is also this very interesting concept called salt sensitivity. And salt sensitivity refers to the fact that different individuals experience varying blood pressure raising effects even from eating the same amount of salt. So not everyone's blood pressure is going to increase when they eat more sodium. Some people are more vulnerable to this than others. Interestingly, one group that we know is very vulnerable to the blood pressure raising effects of salt are African Americans. This is research that shows in the Caucasian Americans compared to African Americans, and the blood pressure raising effect of varying amounts of sodium. And what you can see is that every time the African Americans are experiencing a greater increase in systolic blood pressure compared to their Caucasian counterparts, even when they're consuming the same amount of sodium. But what's even more interesting than this is that there are ways to overcome this salt sensitivity. Research has shown that as potassium intakes increase, racial disparities in blood pressure disappear. And this is a study where they fed people along the x-axis. You can see increasing quantities of potassium. And then they also fed each of the three groups the same amount of salt. But what you can see is that as the potassium intakes increase, those differences between the African Americans and Caucasian Americans suddenly are eliminated once you get to a certain amount of potassium intakes. Now, this is because blood pressure ultimately requires a balance of sodium and potassium. Historically, humans ate 7 times more potassium than sodium. But once again, in our modern context, this ratio has been flipped. And now we eat 3 times more sodium than we do potassium. This is a problem not only for African Americans, but for everyone, because we know that the more potassium anyone eats, the lower their blood pressure is. And this has been demonstrated both for systolic blood pressure and for diastolic blood pressure. And this has to do with the effect of potassium on the distal convoluted tubule. It's very interesting. Potassium acts on the sodium chloride cotransporter. This is actually the same site where thiazide diuretics act. And we know that under normal conditions, our body uses salt to regulate blood pressure. So if we have a low serum sodium level and a low blood pressure, our sodium chloride cotransporter will reabsorb sodium to thus increase blood pressure. And this all works very well in an ideal context. But what we know is that, interestingly, in the context of a low potassium diet, that sodium chloride cotransporter also reabsorbs sodium to raise blood pressure. And worse yet, if you have a low potassium diet alongside high sodium intakes, that sodium chloride cotransporter reabsorbs even more sodium to make your blood pressure even higher. So what this mechanism demonstrates is that the only thing worse than a high sodium diet is a diet that's high in sodium and also low in potassium. And of course, this is a problem because this is exactly what our North American diets look like. We know that 99.4% of Americans consume too much sodium, and less than 2.5% of Americans consume adequate amounts of potassium. So this is a double whammy on our blood pressure regulatory systems. If you think about potassium and where we actually get it from our diets, think about this for a second. What is the best dietary source of potassium? Most people would probably think that it's bananas, because that's what we always talk about. But in reality, the best dietary source of potassium is actually potatoes, whether they're white potatoes or sweet potatoes. They have the highest concentration of potassium. And if you look at the top dietary sources of potassium, you can see that there's potassium in a large range of various fruits and vegetables, a small number of types of fish, and a little bit in yogurt and milk. Theoretically, it is possible to eat the amount of potassium that has been demonstrated in studies to enable the elimination of salt sensitivity. But as you can see from this, you would need to eat a potassium or 2 rich foods at every single meal of your day. So it's theoretically possible, but it would require a lot of effort and organization. If you look at the top sources of potassium in the American diet, not surprisingly, potatoes do contribute the most, but then after potatoes, you get milk, coffee, and tea contributing most of the potassium to our diets. So clearly there's a lot of room for improvement in this department. Now, some people get nervous about potassium in their hypertensive patients, especially if they're on ACEs and ARBs, because we know that ACEs and ARBs can theoretically increase risk for hyperkalemia. But this is research that showed that even in patients on ACEs and ARBs, if you ask them to eat more fruits and vegetables to increase their potassium intakes, it does not increase their risk for hyperkalemia. So you can very confidently recommend this to your patients, even on ACEs and ARBs. Another concern around potassium is in chronic kidney disease patients, because we know patients with CKD can also develop hyperkalemia. But what the research really shows is that unless your CKD patient already has hyperkalemia, it's actually fine for them to eat increased levels of potassium. We don't really need to restrict them until they become that person who's hyperkalemic. Despite this, even in studies on patients with decreased kidney function, this is a study from NHANES data, which basically showed that increased dietary potassium is actually associated with decreased risk for mortality overall in these patients. So we shouldn't be worried about extra potassium in these patients. It's probably only going to help them. So what do we tell our patients? This is a handout that I created to educate my patients about this issue. On one side, I show them the top sources of sodium in the American diet so they can get a sense of where their salt is coming from. But then on the flip side, I show them the top sources of potassium, and I tell them, the more of these foods you eat, the lower your blood pressure will be. And I like this because I'm not just taking things away from my patients, I'm also giving them things that they can eat more of. So it's not just, it kind of is more interesting that way. It's not just don't eat this, it's eat that. And all of my guides are available at nutrition-prescriptions.com, which is a little website I created to share all of these resources so other people can utilize them with their patients as well. So to recap our first little section on nutrition and blood pressure, what we learned is that flax seeds, because of their omega-3 content, actually have significant blood pressure lowering capabilities. We also learned that, eating too much sodium is only half of the blood pressure equation. Insufficient dietary potassium is the second half of the equation that we don't focus on enough. And finally, if we get this balance of potassium and sodium right, we can actually eliminate racial disparities in salt sensitivity. So moving along, let's talk now about diabetes. And for this, I have a case. Let's say you have a 51-year-old male, he's overweight. His A1C for the first time is in the pre-diabetic range, and he wants to prevent diabetes. What is the more efficacious way for you to counsel him on the best way to prevent diabetes? Should you tell him to adhere to the 1992 American Food Guide pyramid and exercise for 150 minutes a week, or should you start him on metformin? Well, evidence shows us that the superior approach is diet and exercise. Diet and exercise is more effective than metformin for preventing the progression of prediabetes to diabetes. And I want to point out, this is the old food guide from the Clinton administration. A lot of people don't even think this is healthy, but it really just is a balanced approach to eating. And this alone can prevent the progression to diabetes. But let's say that doesn't work out and the patient comes back. Their A1C is now 6.5%. You're telling them that they have diabetes. And they say to you, can I reverse my diabetes? What do you tell them? Do you tell them, yes, absolutely you can? Or do you say, I'm so sorry, it's too late? Well, the thing you should tell them is, yes, absolutely, you can reverse diabetes. And research shows that low carbohydrate diets initiated in the first year after a diagnosis of type 2 diabetes can actually enable remission in 70% of patients. So this is quite remarkable. But the question we have to ask is, what is a low carb diet and what does that even look like? Well, in these studies, the low carb diets had 130 grams of carbohydrates per day. That's equivalent to eating a half of a cup of oatmeal at breakfast, a half cup of quinoa at lunch, an apple for a snack, and a cup of pasta at dinner. So as you can see, these are not no carb diets. They just have very modest portions of carbs in the context of an otherwise balanced meal. But of course, your patient comes back, this didn't work out, and he says, Doc, I cannot cut carbs. Isn't there anything else that can be done? And the truth is, there is more that can be done. Cutting carbs is the most obvious way to lower blood sugar levels, but it absolutely is not the only way. So I'm not here today to tell all of your patients to stop eating carbohydrates. There are many ways that you can mitigate the effects of carbohydrate on blood sugar levels. And my approach to doing this almost fits into the 5 W's. We have to talk about what kind of carbs are being eaten, who the carbs are being eaten with, how they're being eaten, when they're being eaten. I have a bit of a why. I technically don't have a where, but we're going to go with this framework anyways. Let's start with what type of carbs are being eaten. The best system for understanding carbs and carb quality and the extent to which a carb will spike blood sugar levels is this thing called the glycemic index. Now, the glycemic index was invented at the University of Toronto, where I did my undergrad, grad school, and medical school. It was invented, though, in the 1980s. This is a picture of me with the inventor of the glycemic index, who was actually on my thesis committee. And what the glycemic index teaches us is that foods like white rice spike your blood sugar. They cause the release of lots and lots of insulin in order to bring blood sugar levels back down to baseline. On the flip side, parboiled rice is a lower glycemic index food. Its carbohydrates are more slowly digested and more slowly absorbed. That results in a more gentle rise in blood sugar, less insulin being released, and then a more calmer return to baseline. So white rice, for this reason, has a high glycemic index with a number of 64, whereas parboiled rice has a lower glycemic index with a GI of 51. Ultimately, the glycemic index ranks all foods from 0 to 100, and the lower the number is, the better. This is another handout that I love giving my patients, because I'm not telling my patients don't ever eat carbs ever again. Instead, I'm showing them which carbs have the greatest potential to spike their blood sugar so that they can learn how to make substitutions that can greatly change their blood sugar levels. The glycemic index is also really interesting because it gives us it tells us really interesting things about food. So we know that like al dente pasta has a lower glycemic index than overcooked pasta. Sweet potatoes have a lower glycemic index than regular potatoes. And even the shape of the pasta matters. Bow tie pasta has a lower glycemic index than penny pasta. So just some interesting things the glycemic index teaches us. One of my pet peeves is when people use the glycemic index to villainize fruits, because sure, certain fruits are high GI, but really, I don't think that most people are getting diabetes because they're eating too many bananas or because they're eating too much watermelon. That might be spiking their blood sugar in the moment, but that's not what got them there. So it's always important to focus on the big picture of what the biggest problem truly is. The next issue is who the carbs are being eaten with. We know that combining carbohydrates with protein can drastically decrease blood sugar spikes. And the more protein you eat with your carbs, the better, as illustrated here. Almonds, another source of protein. Just eating some almonds with your bread lowers the blood sugar peaks by 20%. And this is because different foods are digested at different rates. We know carbohydrates are digested the fastest, protein is slower, and fat is the slowest. So for example, you're gonna love this, even just adding butter to bread lowers the spike of blood sugar that you get from eating that piece of bread. But you'll notice it's only 13%, so adding protein is more efficacious, but still, it's interesting to know this. You're gonna love this even more. Adding cheese to your macaroni also lowers the glycemic index because, again, that cheese contains protein and it contains fat. Also, adding cheese to baked potatoes lowers the glycemic index for the same reasons. Next, I want to talk about how the carbs are being eaten. We know that if you eat a salad before you eat carbohydrates, that results in a 33% lower blood sugar spike compared to eating carbs before you eat a salad. This is because vegetables contain soluble fiber, which dissolves in water after we eat it in our small and large intestines. And when it dissolves in water, it actually forms a gel that then traps the sugar and glucose molecules and slows their absorption. We also know that eating oil or fat before you eat carbs lessens blood sugar spikes. Also, eating vinegar with carbs lowers blood sugar spikes. And again, this is really interesting why this happens. It's because vinegar is acidic, and we know that acids denature proteins. Our digestive enzymes are proteins. So when we eat that vinegar, we're actually knocking out some of those digestive enzymes. With fewer digestive enzymes, we can't digest those carbs as quickly. Those carbs are going to spend more time in our stomach. They're going to be releasing their sugar more slowly into our bloodstream, and we're not going to get the same spike in blood sugar. So if you put all this together, we got vegetables that contain fiber, oil, and vinegar. Sounds like a salad, right? And research has shown that even a salad with olive oil compared to a salad that's dressed with olive oil and vinegar results in a 33% lower blood sugar spike. So the cultural practice of eating salad as a first course at a meal is actually metabolically makes a lot of sense. And if you can dress that salad with olive oil and vinegar, it's going to be even better. Continuing on the theme of how the carbs are being eaten, one thing that I think is fascinating is the literature that has emerged showing how the order in which you eat food makes a big difference. The worst thing you can do is to eat carbs at the beginning of a meal. Better yet, you can eat your carbs, your protein, and your vegetables all mixed together. Just by eating them all mixed together at the same time, you bring the blood sugar spike down by 26%. But there's more you can do. If you eat vegetables first, followed by protein and carbs. Now you bring your blood sugar spike down by 36%. If you eat protein first, followed by vegetable and carbs, now you bring your blood sugar spike down by 41%. And the best thing you can do is to eat your vegetables first, then eat your protein, and then eat your carbs. And if you do this, you bring your blood sugar spike down by 42%. I think this is amazing because we're not even changing the food that someone's eating. We're just changing the order that they eat it in. And just by changing the order that you eat foods in, you can almost cut your blood sugar spike in half. That's pretty remarkable. This also illustrates another social convention that in this case isn't actually as helpful. The notion of a breadbasket appetizer is a bit problematic. So we want to tell our patients, it's not that you can't eat the sourdough bread at the Cheesecake Factory. It's that you want to save it and eat it at the end if you're someone with diabetes who's struggling with blood sugar and you want to minimize those spikes as much as possible. This is really interesting. When carbs are eaten makes a big difference. So we know that if you eat the exact same amount of carbs at lunch and at dinner, your blood sugar spike at dinner is higher. And that is because all of our hormones follow a circadian rhythm. And there's certain times when hormones are low and certain times when other hormones are high, and you want to capitalize on this. I think it makes a lot of sense that we should be eating our carbs earlier in the day because we're kind of like cars, right? Carbohydrates are our fuel. We run off our fuel and our energy. And it makes more sense to fill the gas tank before you go for a long drive. So when you eat carbs at breakfast and at lunch, you're putting that energy in the tank and then you're burning it off and you're not getting the same kind of blood sugar spike. There's this cute little saying, eat breakfast like a king, lunch like a prince, and dinner like a pauper. And even if you don't adhere to this exactly, the more that you can front load your day, the better off you're going to be. Let's go back to this patient for a second. They come to you with a question that you've probably gotten before, which is, hey, doc, what do you think of intermittent fasting? Great question. I bet many of you don't have answers to this. The interesting thing is intermittent fasting, it's very complicated because there's all these different protocols. So when someone says they're doing intermittent fasting, like, what does that even mean? It could mean many different things. I do think time-restricted eating, though, and intermittent fasting can be strategic and can be very helpful. It all depends on how it's done. This is a study where they took diabetics. They had diabetes for a number of years. They were uncontrolled. And all they did is they changed the time in which they were eating. So they had to eat all of their food between 8 a.m. and 6 p.m. and fast for 14 hours overnight. Just doing that for 12 weeks lowered their A1C by 1.54%. To put that into perspective, 2,000 milligrams of metformin per day on average lowers A1C by 1.38%. So again, they didn't change what they were eating. They just changed how they were eating it, the time of day and that fasting window overnight. And that alone can lower blood sugar as much as metformin. This is pretty remarkable. Finally, the why carbs are being eaten. I don't have a good explanation for this, but we also do have to think about things like emotional eating and the fact that people eat out of boredom or people eat to feed their emotions. Those sorts of things can also get in the way when we're talking about carbohydrates. So this is the handout that I give my patients to show them the different things that they can do to mitigate the blood sugar raising effects of carbohydrates. And again, this is available at my website, nutrition-prescriptions.com. So to recap our nutrition and diabetes section, we know that just eating according to the 1992 Food Guide Pyramid and exercising can prevent the progression of prediabetes to diabetes. Low carb diets can reverse diabetes in 70% of patients. And then there are many ways to mitigate the effects of carbs, combining them with protein, dressing them with olive oil and vinegar, eating them at the end of the meal, eating them earlier in the day instead of later in the day, and eating all of your food between 8 and 6 and fasting for 14 hours overnight. Okay. This brings us to our last section, which is nutrition and cholesterol. So our conversation about nutrition and cholesterol is going to start in the most obvious place. We're going to start with saturated fats because saturated fats are the fats that we have eaten or Americans have eaten, for most of their history. And it never really became a problem until the 1950s and 60s when industrial feedlots were invented. And suddenly we could eat larger quantities of saturated fat than ever before. And this is when things started to break down. Because we know that saturated fat increases LDL cholesterol. That is a biological, pathophysiological fact. What has come into question in recent years is the question of whether those saturated fats ultimately translate into higher rates of heart attacks and ultimately death. Some studies have said that you can eat as much saturated fat as you want. It doesn't actually affect heart outcomes. Other studies have disagreed. The Cochrane Review in 2020 showed that actually, if you decrease saturated fat, you decrease cardiovascular events. Part of the reason why I think that there's this controversy around saturated fat is because it's a question of what you replace the saturated fat with. Just taking it out doesn't guarantee that you don't have a heart attack. It's all about what you take it out and then replace it with. The best thing that you can replace saturated fat with is monounsaturated fatty acids, things like olive oil and avocado. And research has shown this, and this is why the Mediterranean diet is so helpful for heart disease. The unique thing about MUFA fats is they're fruit fats, right? They're fats that are coming from fruits. So they're also not just giving us MUFA fats, they're also giving us all kinds of other nutrients as well. So there's a lot going on into why these fats are so healthy. There is this other type of fat that I didn't include on the original fat family tree, but it's trans fats. Trans fats are particularly problematic when we're talking about cholesterol. So trans fats were invented at the turn of the last century because they took vegetable oils, removed one of their double bonds, and were able to make vegetable oils solid at room temperature. So that this enables the trans fats to line up nicely like those saturated fats. This gentleman, William Proctor, is responsible for the integration of trans fats into our diets, because William Proctor and his brother-in-law, James Gamble, were actually candle makers at the turn of the last century. But if you were a candle maker at the turn of the last century, your business was being threatened by electricity, and people didn't need candles the way they did before. But candles are made of wax, and wax is a type of fat. So these guys dealt with types of fat, and they knew that there was this invention, this new solid at room temperature type of fat. And they thought, how can we sell this to people? And they came up with a genius idea. We'll sell it to people as food, and they invented Crisco. Crisco people loved for a long time. It makes the cake taller. It has all kinds of properties from a food manufacturing point of view that are desirable. But the problem is that trans fats increase our LDL cholesterol. If you ate Oreo cookies prior to 2003, the center of the Oreo cookie was made from trans fats. Trans fats no longer exist in the food supply. They've been very successfully removed. But when we think about things like Oreo cookies, it's not just the trans fat that raises your cholesterol. In fact, people often don't realize that high glycemic index carbs, so your processed refined carbs, and sugar can also raise LDL cholesterol. So that's a little known fact. So there are all these foods that raise LDL cholesterol, which we can tell our patients to avoid. But more importantly, we need to tell our patients what they should eat to lower their cholesterol. So let's talk about the foods that decrease LDL cholesterol. And to put this into perspective, we'll just remind ourselves of LDL cholesterol benchmarks. So the average American has an LDL cholesterol level of 116. An optimal cholesterol level would be less than 100. Some people would say that our species really should have an LDL cholesterol level of 50 to 70, but let's just keep these numbers in the back of our mind as we go through these foods. We know that one handful of nuts per day can lower cholesterol levels by 5 milligrams per deciliter. That's 4%. And the research shows that the more nuts you eat, the lower and lower your LDL cholesterol goes. In fact, if you eat 1 cup of almonds per day, you can lower LDL cholesterol by 33%. That's a 30% reduction for the average American. And it's interesting, if you compare the cholesterol lowering effects of almonds to low-dose statin medications, you can see that the almonds lower LDL by about 30%, whereas low-dose statins, in fact, rosuvastatin, lowers LDL by about 45%. So it's almost up there with the medications that we prescribe. And to put this into perspective, 1 cup of almonds looks like this. It's about 100 grams. If you count it out like I did, it's 166 almonds. You'd have to like almonds a lot. Some people tell me, oh, I could totally do this. Other people are like, absolutely not. Depends on the patient in front of you, but it's an interesting thing to consider. We also have to think about the cost, because almonds and nuts can be expensive. But it's interesting, if you compare the cost of using almonds to lower cholesterol versus rosuvastatin, almonds are actually a cheaper way to lower your cholesterol than cholesterol lowering medication. So there's some more incentive for going down the dietary road. If you want to know how nuts lower cholesterol, well, first they have MUFA fats, and we know MUFA fats are good because nuts fit in right there on the dietary fat family tree. Nuts also contain these things called phytosterols or plant sterols. Plant sterols look a lot like cholesterol, as you can see in this slide right here. So when you eat more plant sterols, you actually prevent the absorption of cholesterol, and that's how you lower your LDL cholesterol level. And finally, nuts also contain soluble fiber. So as we talked about earlier, soluble fiber dissolves in water. When it dissolves in water, it decreases our absorption of sugar. Guess what? It also decreases our absorption of cholesterol. So there's all these different types of fiber. We just talked about this. And you find insoluble fiber in certain foods and soluble fiber in other particular foods. And there's a number of different types of soluble fiber. Psyllium fiber is a soluble fiber. We know that if you eat 2 teaspoons of psyllium fiber per day, just adding that to your existing diet, you can lower LDL by 11%. Oats are very high in beta-glucans, a type of soluble fiber. 1 cup of oats per day can lower LDL by 6%. Barley, also very high in beta-glucans. 3/4 cup of barley lowers LDL by 15%. Beans and legumes, 3/4 cup per day lowers LDL by 6%. And finally, flax seeds, 4 tablespoons per day has a modest effect on lowering LDL cholesterol. One of the things we tell our patients all the time, which is good advice, is to eat more fruits and vegetables. But interestingly, the Cochrane review looking at fruits and vegetables showed that 5 to 9 servings of fruits and vegetables per day actually doesn't lower your LDL cholesterol that much. But there are particular fruits that can lower LDL, and that is apples. Apples contain pectin, which is a soluble fiber, and that 2 apples per day can lower LDL by about 6%. So there are all these foods that when added to the diet can lower LDL cholesterol. But what about replacing certain foods? What if we swap butter for olive oil? What if we swap beef burgers for soy burgers? How do those numbers change? Well, if you replace your butter with olive oil, you can probably bring your cholesterol down by about 12%. And if you replace all of your animal protein with plant protein, you can probably bring your cholesterol down by another 19%. So here's a bunch of different things that we can tell our patients to do. But are the effects additive? What if our patient does every single one of these things? Will it add up to an astronomical decrease in LDL cholesterol? Well, there is this thing called the portfolio diet, which did just that. It combined all of these elements and tested their effect on cholesterol. The portfolio diet was also invented at the University of Toronto at the hospital where I did my clerkship. This is me again with the inventor of the portfolio diet. And the portfolio diet combined nuts, plant protein, fiber, and plant sterols. And when it was tested in a randomized controlled trial that was published in JAMA, it showed that after just 2 weeks, the portfolio diet could lower LDL by about 30%, which is equivalent to low-dose statins. And if you're interested in hard outcomes, new research is emerging that shows from the Women's Health Initiative that portfolio-style diets can decrease risk for coronary events. So it does translate into hard outcomes as well. So what do we tell our patients? Well, this is a handout that I give my patients. Again, it's on my website. You can give it to your patients as well. And I just tell my patients, doing any one of these things will lower your cholesterol. If you do all of them, you'll get a maximal reduction. So to recap, these are the foods that raise cholesterol, the foods that lower cholesterol. The portfolio diet is equal to low-dose statins. And even a cup of almonds is almost equal to low-dose statins. So people always ask me, what's the secret to healthy eating? And the truth is there is no secret. In 500 BC, Plato talked about nutrition, and he said a healthy diet consists of barley, wheat, legumes, fruit, fish, and olive oil. And he said treats to be consumed in moderation were meat, confectionaries, and wine. 2,000 years later, nothing's really changed. The principles of healthy eating are the same, and they always have been. My nutrition philosophy is simple. I think balance is really important. Balance looks like this. At every meal, you want to have vegetables, a little bit of protein, and a little bit of carbs. The food guide also recommends the same thing. You have to know yourself because everyone's ideal diet is different. You shouldn't consume anything in excess, maybe olive oil, I'm just kidding, but nothing in excess. Everything has to be balanced. I think structure is important. As we talked about, the time of day when you eat foods, the order in which you eat foods matters. You have to respect your taste buds because if you're constantly eating really salty, really sugary foods, you're not going to appreciate the more subtle tastes of fruits and vegetables. And finally, treats are fine. We should all enjoy treats sometimes. It's just we have to eat them as treats, not every single day, and definitely not at every single meal. So to recap, we talked about flax seeds, how they're high in omega-3s, how the omega-3s and 6s are related, how we eat too many omega-6s, they get incorporated into our cell membranes. But if we eat more flax seeds, we can lower our blood pressure. We talked about sodium, how there's salt sensitivity differences, how a way to mitigate that is with more potassium, and potassium comes from these types of foods. We talked about diabetes and how you can prevent diabetes with the 1992 food guide and how low carb diets can reverse diabetes. We talked about how what type of carbs you're eating matters, who they're being eaten with, how they're being eaten, and of course, when they're being eaten. We talked about cholesterol raising foods, how there's this controversy around LDL and saturated fat, but ultimately, if you replace your saturated fat with MUFA fats, you're probably going to do well. Trans fats were a problem. They've been largely removed from the food supply. And then we contrasted the foods that increase LDL to the foods that decrease LDL. Foods that lower cholesterol were barley, psyllium fiber, beans, oats, apples, nuts, flax seeds, butter. Butter should be swapped for olive oil. Beef should be swapped for plant sources of protein. We talked about the portfolio diet, how almonds and the portfolio diet are roughly equivalent to low-dose statin medications, how Plato talked about nutrition in 500 BC and nothing has really changed, and how ultimately it's all about balance. So thank you so much for listening. We blew through a lot of content to keep on time, but I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you want more information, I have all of my nutrition prescriptions on my website, nutrition-prescriptions.com, and you can also find my content in other places as well. So thank you so much. I hope that was enjoyable. We have maybe like a minute or two for questions. I know I have to run to clinic. I know you guys probably have places to run to as well. But I think that's everything. Thanks so much for listening.